You are listening to MCC Votes and Seats, the podcast series of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. We provide election insights with experts and politicians. Dear listeners, this time we will talk about the legislative election that was held in Austria on the 29th of September 2024 to elect the 28th National Council, the lower house of Austria's bicameral parliament. We have the privilege to have Dr. Schölhammer, assistant professor of international relations at Webster Vienna Private University and a head of the Center of Applied History and International Relations here at MCC. Mr. Schölhammer is a regular commentator of Sky News Australia, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, as well as the Jerusalem Post, among others. Hey Ralph, it's good to have you with us. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me, Balint. Looking forward to a robust discussion.
The 2019 legislative election was called after the so-called Ibiza scandal, which triggered the collapse of the coalition government between the Austrian People's Party and the Freedom Party of Austria, led by Chancellor Sebastian Kurz. The coalition was ousted in a motion of no confidence and replaced by an interim government. The election delivered a strong victory for the ÖVP, the People's Party, which rose to 37.5%, while FPÖ, the Freedom Party, declined to 16%. The ÖVP formed a coalition with the Greens, who gained 14% of the vote. However, in late 2021, there was a corruption probe targeting Kurz and his inner circle on accusations of alleged bribery. As a result, the Chancellor resigned from all offices and would retire from politics. Interior Minister Karl Nehammer was elected as the new head of the government. Now, let's move to the 2024 elections. What are the main issues that are worth mentioning about this victory of the Freedom Party and all the rest that we could learn yesterday in Austria?
Well, I think the two most important things are that this is for the first time since 1945, so since the Second World War, that it was neither the People's Party, the Conservatives, or the Social Democrats that came in first during an election. So this is really a massive historical event that took place. It's the end, if you want, of a tradition that was going on for almost 80 years. So I think this is really something that is quite remarkable. And the second equally remarkable point is, as you just mentioned, the FPÖ, the Freedom Party, right? They always stumbled over one scandal or another. I'm in 2003, right? The then leader of the party, Jörg Haider, was, for whatever reason, nobody knows to this point, was visiting Saddam Hussein in Iraq right before the invasion of the US, which was a very odd timing. Exactly as I mentioned before, right, in 2019, we had the video recording of the then head of the party, Heinz-Christian Strache, who was doing nothing criminal, right? All the court cases ended being overturned, so he was not sentenced or convicted of anything, but the optics were disastrous, right? He was like in Ibiza, drunkenly planning how they would reshape and kind of change the Austrian political makeup. Again, nothing that was said was illegal and nothing of the things that were planned were actually done. But, you know, in politics, optics matter, so this was then enough of a reason to cause the government to collapse. Although one has to admit, as you also mentioned correctly in the introduction, then Chancellor Sebastian Kurz was making a bet, right? He was hoping that this scandal would tarnish the FPÖ to such a degree that he would get enough votes from the Freedom Party to get an absolute majority in parliament and he would then not have needed any partner in a coalition. So as you mentioned, he got 37% and that turned out not to be enough. So they had to coalesce with the Greens. The last point is the FPÖ, for all its troubles on the personnel level, they tended to be quite right on the issues. I think this is one of the reasons why they never went away, and as you just mentioned, right, that they came in first in yesterday's elections. By the way, quite significantly, I think it's now they got 28.8%, and the second placed Volkspartei, the People's Party, got I think 26.3%. So this is a comfortable 2 percentage point advantage that they have. So this is not the kind of head-on-head race that we were promised. And the reason is a very simple one, because since the early 90s, the FPÖ has always made particularly migration their core topic. And the problem of migration has only gotten worse since the 90s up to now. And it has gotten particularly worse in the urban areas in Austria, but of course also in parts of the rural areas since 2015. And this was, I think, the natural reaction to this.
A very important thing happened in early 2023 when the ÖVP Greens government decided to to reform the voting law. And they introduced an early voting period starting 3 weeks before the election day, during which voters can request absentee ballots in each municipality. Another novelty was the counting of almost all absentee and mail ballots on the election day instead of the Monday or Thursday after the election. Other reforms included measures to lower the number of invalid or sabotaged votes, and high fines and a prison sentence of up to 2 weeks would be introduced for election commission members who deliberately leak election results. Did it have any impact on this election?
Well, let me say two things. I'm not a fan of mail-in ballots. I think this time it was an absolute record. About 22% of all ballots that were cast were mailed in. The election is the high point of a democracy. If you want to participate, Austria has a very close net of ballot places. I mean, for example, mine was about 10 minutes of a walk from my apartment, and that's pretty much true for everyone. I think if you really want to participate in a democracy, unless you're elderly, unless you're in a wheelchair or something, yes, there should be exceptions. But simply saying, I'm too lazy to go on voting day, on election day to a polling station, I have to mail it in. I'm not a fan of this. I think it always potentially opens up the door for fraud. On the upside, on the positive side, is that the last polling station closed on Sunday at 5 p.m. and at midnight, every single one, including mail-in ballots, all results were in. I mean, I always, in a kind of a bragging fashion, tell this to my American friends, right? That Arizona has 7 million inhabitants, Austria has 9 million, but we managed to have a final election result pretty much not even 9 hours after, 6-7 hours after the election took place. In Arizona, it takes 3 months to have a final result. So in that way, from the way the elections were conducted, despite even the new law, in many cases, because, I have to admit, is a source of pride in Austria. Like there's not even a smidgenette of suspicion of fraud. And, the ballots are counted where they are collected. There is no carrying around of boxes with ballots and all of kind of these things that very often then justifiably so create the suspicion. So I think in that sense, it's a very, very good election system, and it worked perfectly, right? Everybody, now we sit here one day after the election, we know precisely who voted when and where and what the results are. I think that's a very good sign for democracy.
Talking about the election results, we had the Freedom Party of Austria that gained almost 30% of the vote. So the winner of this election, that can be translated into 58 mandates in the lower house, I guess.
Yes.
The People's Party came second with 26.1%, which is a significant drop for them in parliamentary mandates. They have now 52, or they will have 52 parliamentary mandates. And then the Social Democrats with 21%, which means 41 mandates, and two minor parties managed to get in the legislation of Austria, the Greens, or the Green Alternative, with 8%, and the NEOS, the Reformist Liberal Party.
Yes.
It was quite obvious, based on the communications of party leaders and that of the head of state of Austria, that it would be very tricky and very difficult for the Freedom Party to form a government, especially with its party leader, Kickl.
One could argue that even if the FPÖ almost got 30%, right, other parties got 70%. And that's a correct assessment. That does not mean that everybody, for example, who voted for the Conservatives, for the People's Party, is against the coalition between the Freedom Party and the People's Party. I would even go so far to say that the actual will of the voters is a center-right government. Now we can have a conversation about what a center-right government would look like, but I think that's absolutely clear. Austria, even more so, I would argue in some ways, was similar to Hungary, has always been a center-right country, right? We're not like the French, we're not even like the Germans, that there's a tendency to experiment with left-wing coalitions and left-wing parties. This is something that might now happen, but the only reason why this is the case is exactly as I mentioned previously, is that they desperately try to keep the FPÖ from playing any role in the future government. But that's not because of election arithmetic. That's not because of them not wanting to govern. That's because everybody else is trying to exclude them, which I think is a fool's errand as a strategy, because it will only make them stronger. I mean, I have no problem with this. But if you say we enter into a government and the only purpose of the government is to make sure that somebody else is not in government, that's not a reform program, right? Austria has serious issues. We had the lowest economic growth. Well, technically we had negative growth, so the economy was shrinking. On a per capita basis, the worst of all 27 EU member states, on average between 2019 and 2024. We are falling behind in competitiveness rankings. We have huge outstanding debt. So Austria needs reforms. And if the only answer is, well, we can't do reforms, but we can exclude the FPÖ from government, that's not going to be enough. Right? So it's not just a migration issue. There is a whole list of things that need to be solved. And the Conservatives at the Freedom Party would have, you named the seats in parliament, they would have a comfortable majority with around 108, 109 seats out of 183. So this would work quite nicely. And what we're probably now going to get is a potential coalition between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, which I think has like 93 seats, which is kind of the barest of the bare possible majorities that you can have. Or they might take in a third party, the Liberals, for example, the Neos that you mentioned before. But Austria never had a three-party coalition, so there's no experience with this. So the likelihood of that being a successful government is simply very slow. I mean, never say never, but the Conservatives are conservative, more or less. Not as conservative as I would like them to be. They're not like Fidesz, but they are center-right. But the Social Democrats moved significantly to the left. So there is this irony that actually the Freedom Party and the Conservatives, if you only look at the party programs, I would say there's like 80% overlap. Between the Social Democrats and the Conservatives, there's maybe, let's say, 20-25% overlap. So simply by the logic that a party says, we have a program we want to execute, the Conservatives would have to go together with the Freedom Party. The only reason not to do this is to say we don't like Kickl. But to be honest, personalities do matter. I agree with that. But overall, at the end of the day, it's programs, it's policy that matters. So the FPÖ program is not going to change whoever is in charge. And of course, as you also mentioned correctly, if you come in first, they're not gonna stage a coup against their successful party leader. So I don't really know what the ÖVP is expecting. And that's, as I said before, that's a dangerous strategy, because if almost 30% of Austrians accept Herbert Kickl, then it's at least somewhat likely that during the next election it's going to be 35%, it's going to be 40%. And how long can you play this game of simply then making more and more and more coalitions just to exclude the party? I think it's not going to work. And frankly, I think it's ignoring the will of the voters, in the sense, not as I said before, I don't think that the voters necessarily want the FPÖ in government, but they want a center-right government. And the only way to get it is if the Freedom Party and the Conservatives enter into a coalition. Otherwise, it's going to be a left of center government. And if you, as you also mentioned, if you look at the actual outcome, the Social Democrats are imploding. 20%, I think it was 21.1%. That's devastating, right? In the late 2000s, they had 37% thereabouts. So this is like in Germany with the Social Democrats. Like the social democracy is dying. The Greens lost, I think they had 14 in the last election. I think this time they had 8.6 or something. So they lost almost half of their voter base. And the Liberals won 1 percentage point. So not necessarily the greatest of all successes. And all these small new parties that were also almost all of them left-leaning, none of them made it into parliament. So obviously the people rejected center-left policies or center-left to far-left policies, and they reaffirmed right-wing policies. So why would you give them then a center-left government? It's a mistake to always say 30% is not 51%. That is true. But it's not just about the parties. It's also kind of to decipher what direction do people want the country move in. And the people want the country to move towards the right. Now, but even if I would be a communist, if I look at these election results, they speak a very clear language and they don't really broker an argument that would go into another direction.
If I'm correct, there are already 3 regions of Austria where the People's Party is in coalition with Freedom Party at the regional legislation, and they have already been in coalition at national level.
And it works, right? In Salzburg, in Upper Austria, and in Lower Austria, and particularly Lower Austria and Upper Austria are economically very, very important regions. It works because they are, when it comes to the party programs and even when it comes to attitudes, it's true the Freedom Party, I think, is in areas where in rhetoric and some areas they are more I don't like the word radical, but let's say they are more forceful, right? They, from remigration and having harsher attitudes also towards the European Union. So there are some differences. But in economic programs and in a general idea of, again, in which direction the country should move, they are very, very, very similar, which is why these coalition governments have no problems finding a compromise both sides can live with. And that's simply not going to be possible, let's say, in a social democrat conservative government, because the social democrats have moved so far to the left. The kind of overlap that existed 20, 25, 30 years ago is simply no longer there.
Just to conclude this topic, as you already mentioned, the political left was quite fragmented with all the minor parties. I just recommend it for political science nerds and social science nerds to check out the programs of these minor parties. They are mostly single-issue parties, and it was very strange to see that they are still protesting against compulsory vaccination or the genocide in Gaza and stuff like that. So it was very interesting.
The FPÖ was very critical of the corona measures, the COVID measures taken by the government. I think that did make a difference in this election. I think the 2 to 3% that pushed them into number one, I think a significant part of those percentage points were people who said, I voted for the Social Democrats, I voted for the Conservatives in the past, but because of their COVID policy, I'm now switching to the Freedom Party. And the other thing, as I said, for political science nerds, what you see with all these new parties, they are all left of center to far left parties, which shows you that particularly left of center, there is a vacuum, that apparently the left of center is fragmenting because there is no cohesive party with even the Social Democrats along ours. When the Social Democrats are imploding, right, this opens up then room and space for other left-wing parties.
Talking about the factors that helped Freedom Party win the elections, what were the main issues that caused the victory of the party?
If I would have to, in descending order of importance, number one is migration. There can be no doubt about this. This is every poll shows it. And even when you ask FPÖ voters what was the reason that they voted for the party, unequivocally the answer is migration. That really is the main topic. But we can talk about this also. There's some difference between rural areas and urban areas. The second one, I believe, still the argument I made before, COVID. This was the first federal election, with the exception of the EU elections, which usually only has very low voter turnout. And this time we had almost 80%. So we had significant higher voter turnout than last time. So COVID was definitely a factor. And thirdly, and equally quite interesting, the FPÖ was really good in mobilizing. Like they mobilized an additional 250,000 votes from the previously non-voting bloc. So they did a very good job. Herbert Kickl, the leader of the FPÖ, is not what you would define, I think, as a charismatic leader. Right? He's no Jörg Haider, he's no Nigel Farage. This is not the kind of guy where if he holds a speech, you say, I have to turn on the TV because this is something you want to see. But he did the thing probably most important in this election. People had an opinion of him. The way in which they ran the campaign, nobody changed their opinion of him that much. So they knew who he was, and the perception remained the same. The problem the Social Democrats had, and I know this is a mean thing to say, but I think this really mattered, was that Andreas Babler, the head of the party, he was the mayor in a small town in Lower Austria. But apart from that small town, nobody really knew him, right? He was an unknown for most Austrians. And in the course of the campaign, it kind of turned out that he's not a very likable person. In many ways, he was the exact opposite. So it's bad enough that the Social Democrats no longer have a vision of what they want to be politically. But if you then also have a candidate who is not likable, then it makes complete sense that you simply cannot win an election, because one has to keep in mind that the Conservatives lost part of the vote and the Greens lost part of the vote. But one could argue, of course they did. They were in government, right? It's always easier to be the opposition party than being the governing party. But the Social Democrats were also in opposition and they didn't move.
Yeah, so they are stagnating.
Exactly, they are stagnating now. Well, actually, I would go further. It's less a stagnation than a slow decline since the early 2000s. Again, very similar to what we saw happening to the Social Democrats in France, where they're basically now non-existent, or what is currently happening to the Social Democrats in Germany under Olaf Scholz. Because the social democracy no longer knows what it stands for, and we have proof for that. And I know we're going to get into this in a second, but I think it's a good point just to mention it now. The Social Democrats did fairly well in Vienna. So Vienna is still solidly in socialist hands. But if you look at the breakdown on the different, like it is in Budapest, like you have all these different districts. And what you see is that the working class districts moved towards the Freedom Party, whereas the affluent, the districts where the wealthy and the rich live, they move towards the Social Democrats. And the problem the Social Democrats have, they will have to decide that and this would be, Doskozil would like the Social Democrats to be basically a red version of the Freedom Party. Right? Left-wing economic policies, but a right-wing migration policies and right-wing cultural and social issues.
Approach.
Exactly. But the current Social Democrats are basically just a slightly different version of the Greens. And you see this in the profile of the people who vote for them. Like the working class is turning their back on them, but the Greens, more or less, they took a second look. And this is a problem because you cannot simultaneously be the woke class and the working class party. It has to be one or the other. And if a party doesn't know who they are, well, then the voters don't know why they should vote for you. And this is, I think, exactly what we saw in this election.
We are seeing a whole European trend, actually, with the slow but sure decline of social democratic parties and the rise of right-wing sovereignist parties.
Let me add just this quick point. I don't think it's just a European phenomenon. You see exactly the same thing in the United States. Right? The Democrats are now, for better or worse, the party of the affluent elite. And the Republicans under Donald Trump are the party of the working class. I mean, again, whether or not we like this is a separate question, but this is what every poll, this is kind of what every election result increasingly is showing. The working class culturally was always right-wing. They were economically to the left for numerous reasons, but culturally they were always right-wing. And of course, it is the working class, it is the low-income areas that suffer most from mass migration, because all these migrants, and most of them, right, they are not rich people. So they move into low-income areas, and those are the areas where the working class lives. So they feel the brunt of all the negative consequences of mass migration. So they look at the options on the ballot, right? And they say, okay, who is most credible in their rhetoric, in their proposals regarding putting a stop to mass migration? And those are the right-wing parties. I mean, the voter is not, I find it always funny when you read newspaper articles, because most of the journalists are also left of center. The behavior of the voters, it's a mysterious being. The voter, the mysterious creature, nobody can understand. The voters say absolutely clear before every election what they want and what bothers them. If you then go out, as by the way, again, did many people, journalists particularly, in Austria after yesterday's election, if you then go out and say, oh, the voters are the problem because they are just too stupid, well, then don't be surprised if you lose elections.
If we take a look at the voters' behaviors and motivations, amid rising inflation, skyrocketing housing prices, electricity prices, fuel and grocery prices,
yes,
the former government lost considerable support in their subsequent regional elections throughout the years, and Nehammer's government implemented a package of measures worth 6 billion euros aimed at supporting households. However, it might have increased inflation further.
I think so, absolutely, yes.
And it was also a major motivation for voters to opt for another option on the political right. And as other topics, I guess we can mention the war in Ukraine that appeared in the campaign, energy prices and energy issues, and sustainable development. And, these green ideas, environmental protection did not really rule this campaign as it did back in 2019.
Correct. Well, let me put it this way. If you are the current government, if your party is currently in government, I think before every election, there are two questions that you have to ask the electorate. One is, are you better off now than you were 5 years ago? And the second one is, are you more or less pessimistic about the future? And if the answer to both of these questions is no, so if people say no, they're not better off than they were 5 years ago, they might even be worse off, and no, they're not, or they are pessimistic but not optimistic about the future, then you know that you have a problem. And again, Chancellor Nehammer, I think, is not a bad person by any means, but the idea then to say, no, we actually were really good in government and you guys are doing so much better than you did before. You just don't get it. You just don't understand how great we were. That's a strategy that is not working. Again, we see the same in Germany at every election when now the AfD comes in first, and I always like the comparison with the Germans. Well, then the argument is, the voters just don't understand how great Olaf Scholz is, how great Robert Habeck is. No, they understand very well. It's just that they are not great, right? They might perceive themselves to be, but they are not. And to communicate to the voter, you're too stupid to evaluate your own living conditions. I mean, that's a very absurd thing to do. Like if you say, okay, I look back 5 years ago, things were cheaper, the future looked brighter, there was no war, there was no inflation. So yeah, the situation looks worse than it did 5 years ago. And then a politician comes and says, Balint, you're wrong. You are doing so much better than you did 5 years ago. You're just too stupid to realize it. I mean, would you then say, you know what? You got my vote. Because you just told me that everything I feel in my and see in my environment, in my social circumstances, is just my imagination. And in fact, I am just as stupid as you tell me that I am. And don't think that this is not how you would react. You would say, so first of all, you make the situation worse. And if I recognize that the situation is worse, you call me stupid. Then you probably will go to a party where you don't feel that they disrespect you. And this is exactly what's currently happening.
Absolutely. And it's not just economic issues. It's personal security as well.
Of course.
Because especially after the 2024 Vienna terrorism plot,
yes,
in which the Islamic State unsuccessfully tried to target concerts of Taylor Swift, the whole campaign shifted heavily towards the issue of extremist Islam in Austria, their presence, and of course the immigration and the unsuccessful integration of Muslim migrants in Austria. What were the main slogans of this topic in the party's communications?
I mean, before the elections, all of a sudden, every party was very critical of migration. But it is very difficult to be credible in this sudden shift if you have been in power for 4.5 years and you didn't do anything about it. And the Freedom Party has a huge advantage. I always like to tell this story. My theory is that, in fact, not just in Austria, but globally, that right-wing populism took its beginnings in Austria in the early 90s. In 1992, the then head of the Freedom Party, the late Jörg Haider, he issued a referendum that was called Austria First, in German, Österreich zuerst. And basically, the content of that referendum was to end mass migration, to more money for law enforcement and police, making sure that the German remains the main spoken language in schools, and so on and so on and so on. And in the early 90s, nobody had the whole migration thing as much on the radar as everybody does now, with the exception of the Freedom Party. So what they can do now, justifiably so, they can point back and say, we told you for 30 years that the migration policies we're currently pursuing will blow up in our face. And they did. And no other party has that kind of credibility. And that matters. The FPÖ, for better or worse, but when it comes to migration, they were right and everybody else was wrong. We can like or dislike this outcome, but that is a fact. They said since the early 90s, in writing, in referendums, in every election campaign, that too many people are coming. It's a threat to social cohesion. It's not an economic benefit. It ruins our schools. It ruins working class neighborhoods, and it's only going to get worse. And this is precisely what happened. They didn't even need a slogan. I think that the outcome of the election was baked into the cake 2 years ago. The only question was how the votes will shift between the Social Democrats and the Greens. But you mentioned the full terror plot for the Taylor Swift concert. And I think you're right. That kind of highlighted the issue. In the media, in the chattering classes, right, in media and academia, what so many don't understand is it's not that people are afraid of terrorist attacks. That too, but that's not the main thing. What really bothers them is that the world in which they grew up is changing. It's changing quickly, and it's changing in a way they don't like. And I can give you a concrete example of this. By the way, I'm one of those people, to be completely frank here. It gives people pause. It makes them feel uncomfortable if you in certain districts in Vienna enter the subway and every single woman is wailed in the thing. Because, this is not Austria. There are parts of Vienna, just as there are parts of London. Again, for our listeners in Budapest, that must sound like dystopian science fiction. But there are parts in Austria, in the cities particularly, it's not so in the rural areas, as they're in Paris, as they're in London, that are no longer recognizably Austrian, British, or French, and people don't like it. People are bothered by it. They don't want to say anything because if you say that, then you're racist. But they do voice it in the voting booth, and this is why the party wins. And I think these victories are entirely justified. People have a right to a continuation of their own cultures, their own traditions, their customs, and they feel that that right is taken away from them on behalf or to the benefit of migrants who just recently crossed the border. And just as a last point, because I think that sentiment is justified, the idea that somebody has lived in a country for generations, paid taxes, is entirely equal to somebody who just came across the border yesterday is absurd. But this is what almost all parties, with the exception of the Freedom Party, have claimed for 30, 40, 50 years. And it's a sense of injustice. It's a sense of unfairness. And I think that sense is absolutely correct. Just as in Hungary, right, there are people who have over generations contributed to the social capital, the cultural capital, the economic capital of Austria, of Hungary, you name the country. And the idea that these people are not entitled to be treated as a priority compared to someone who just came across the border, I think is a deeply, deeply unjust system. And this is what people are at the voting booth revolting against.
How the messages of the political parties that ran in the ballot were communicated to the electorate? Did you see any novelty in the campaigning methods this time?
Yes, the Freedom Party had a very odd campaign. Like they used somewhat religious language. It was like you had a picture of Herbert Kickl where he said, in English it sounds a little bit funny, but I'm just your tool of the people, and your will happen, shall happen. It was very odd. I think they thought that they can maybe carve off whatever religious community still exists in Austria. The Greens did their usual thing, climate, and a little bit more climate, which, as you mentioned correctly before, that was simply not an important topic for most voters. The Social Democrats, since they have a lack of a vision, only had ideas of how to redistribute somebody else's wealth, which apparently also did not land with the people. And the Conservative Party tried to be, that's literally what you also put on the billboards, that they are the party of the middle, the party of the center, which again, I think was a strategic mistake because people want radical change. Only a politician can think like this. The center, that's where most people are. No. When things go well, maybe, if you're in the Titanic, you see the iceberg and you're full speed ahead into the iceberg. And then one party says, we need to change course, right? The Freedom Party. And then another party says, oh, no. We just have to reduce speed slightly. Yeah, but that only means you're going to hit the iceberg 5 minutes later, but you're still going to hit the iceberg. So people want radical change because they say we want to avoid hitting the iceberg. And I think this is something that the Conservatives did not understand.
What would be this iceberg for Austria?
One is, if we do not make structural reforms, some of them I would argue could be done in the same way that Hungary has done them, right? Less bureaucracy, less regulation, more encouragement for entrepreneurs, more encouragement for startups, kind of trying to pursue somewhat like the strategy of connectivity that Hungary is pursuing. I think that would be one thing. And the other one, of course, is, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but of course, is mass migration. It's very odd, right? Since 9/11 in 2001, the first Islamic terrorist attack that really everybody kind of knows that happened, that was kind of seared into the collective memory. Since that day, right, Muslim immigration into Austria, but all over the West, has doubled, tripled, or in some cases even quadrupled. I mean, this is completely odd. Now, yes, I know, not every Muslim is a terrorist. I'm fully aware of all of that. But it's a statistical likelihood that if Islamic terrorists are recruited from the Muslim minority, that if that minority is growing, then also the likelihood of terrorism is growing, as we saw, as you mentioned before, the attempted terrorist attack on the Taylor Swift concert. I mean, this is complete logic, right? If terrorism comes from a specific group, even if not every member of that group is a terrorist, then if that group grows in size, that likelihood is increasing. I mean, and the reason why, for example, Israel can play its soccer games in Debrecen or in other places in Hungary is because Hungary has a very, very small Muslim minority, which also means that the likelihood of anti-Semitism, of terrorism, you name it, is significantly smaller. One argument that has been made against the FPÖ is they only have simple answers or alleged simple answers to complex problems. But the problems are not that complex, right? Just as we are talking right here, it's quite obvious, whether it's in the realm of the economy or in the realm of migration, where the problems are coming from. This is the cheap escape route for the established parties that, oh, it's all so complex, we can't do anything. Oh, no, it's not complex. You just don't want to do what is necessary. And increasingly, of course, now people give their votes to parties where they hope that they will do what's necessary. Again, the same phenomenon we saw with Nigel Farage in the UK, we see with Le Pen in France, we saw with Trump in the United States, and we might see it with Trump again in the United States in about a month's time, and also what we see with the AfD in Germany. So again, I don't think that any of this is a great mystery. It makes complete sense.
So, Ralph, until now you genuinely drafted a general picture about contemporary Austrian society. However, if we zoom in into the smaller elements that make Austria the nation, I guess we can see, or we will see, nuances and differences as far as the electoral geography is considered, talking about the legislative elections of September 2024. You mentioned Vienna as a red bastion, the socialist. What can be said about the other regions and major cities of Austria?
Well, the urban areas still tend to vote to the left. The socialists came in, as if I remember correctly, I think in 3 out of the 5 largest cities, they came in first. The urban elite, they vote left-wing, which, just as a quick side note, it's quite ironic because, for example, in the energy sector, in the environmental sector, of course, cities are significantly a larger burden on the environment than rural areas. But for whatever reason, it's the people who live in the cities who tend to vote left-wing. In the rural areas, this was another quite remarkable thing. The conservatives had a very strong support structure in rural Austria, in the agricultural lobbies, the agricultural industry, the farming lobby. They all were usually solidly voting for the People's Party. That has changed. I'm glad you asked this question. There are kind of these undercurrents of the election that show that specific groups who until very recently were solidly connected to one specific party, they start to shift. It's very ironic because in many areas where the Freedom Party did best were areas where there is not a lot of migration going on. And of course the question is, why would people who don't have a lot of migration happening in their areas vote for a party that is against migration? And the reason, again, it's not that complicated, is because they see what's happening to areas where there is mass migration. So it's almost a preventive vote. They say, we don't want our town, city, community end up like the 10th district in Vienna. So that's why they vote for right-wing parties or for the Freedom Party, even though currently at the time of speaking, they don't have significant migration. But this is like saying non-smokers have no right to talk about the negative effects of smoking because they don't smoke themselves. And it's the same with migration, right? To say you can only talk about migration if you experience migration, that's a very odd thing to say. But this is, once again, there is really a disconnect between the media and the establishment parties and the majority or a significant part of the electorate and the people.
To conclude this wonderful conversation, personally, what did you find the most interesting about this election?
A significant part of the Austrians have sent a clear signal that the current course of the country cannot be continued. I find it encouraging. I find even more encouraging the fact that even though you're a party and the entire media establishment, the entire cultural establishment, all of academia is against you, people don't care. I find this very encouraging. People are much more capable of forming an opinion on their own, independently of what whether it's the media or celebrities tell them. And this I find quite encouraging. I found the high voter turnout very encouraging. There is this myth that right-wing populism is a threat to democracy. I think it's the exact opposite. It's a reinvigoration of democracy. The same, by the way, in Germany. More people go to elections. More people participate in politics. That's a good thing. That's what we want in a democracy. And yes, the Social Democrats and the Conservatives were in charge for 80 years. Maybe it's time for something new.
That's a wonderful concluding remark. Thank you very much, Dr. Ralph Schölhammer. Thanks to your most appreciated thoughts and insights, views about the Austrian society and the background of the election. We can now see the bigger picture about the 2024 legislative elections in Austria. We wish you all good luck for your future endeavors. Ralph Schölhammer, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Balin. Thanks for having me.